A single mother and her son move into a strange house on a hillside that has been empty for decades. Inside, they find something no one would expect. One winter changes their lives and reveals a long-forgotten secret. Subscribe to the channel and write in the comments which city you are watching from. The letter arrived on a Tuesday, slipped between a grocery flyer and a late electricity bill. Its official envelope already creased, as if it had traveled a long way before finally reaching her kitchen table. She almost threw it away without opening it. At that point in her life, anything that looked formal usually meant trouble. Another reminder of what she owed, another notice that something was overdue, another thinly veiled accusation that she was failing to keep up. Only the unfamiliar return address made her pause. A county office she did not recognize, a place name she had not spoken aloud in years. She opened it standing by the counter, still in her coat, the smell of cold air clinging to her hair. The language was dry and precise, stripped of any concern for how it might land. It informed her that she was the next of kin to a property recently cleared through probate. A structure listed without enthusiasm or detail, located in a mountainous forest zone several hours north. The house had belonged to her grandmother's sister, a woman she barely remembered, a name that surfaced only in fragments at family gatherings before being quietly dropped. The letter ended with instructions, deadlines, and a suggestion that she either accept or formally decline the inheritance within 60 days. She read it twice, then a third time, as if repetition might reveal something hidden between the lines. A house. Not an apartment, not money, not a bank account, but a house. Or rather, a structure, as the document carefully called it. No assessed value was listed, no estimated worth, just coordinates, a parcel number, and a note that the building was currently classified as non-residential due to its condition and prolonged vacancy. Her first reaction was irritation. This was not help. This was not relief. This was another complication dropped into a life already held together by routine and exhaustion. She set the letter down and went to wake her son for school, pushing the thought aside the way she had learned to push aside anything that did not demand immediate action. He was 8, thin for his age, with the kind of quiet presence that made teachers describe him as well-behaved, and relatives worry that he was too withdrawn. The divorce had done that. Or maybe it had simply revealed what had always been there. She shook him gently, watched him surface from sleep, and helped him into clothes that had been washed too many times but still fit. Breakfast was toast and peanut butter, eaten quickly at the small table by the window, while she drank coffee that had gone cold before she remembered to take a sip. The letter followed her through the day. It sat folded in her bag while she worked, then reappeared that evening when she emptied her pockets onto the counter. She read it again after her son went to bed, standing in the quiet kitchen with the overhead light buzzing faintly. This time, she noticed details she had missed before. The house had been passed down several times, each transfer noted in the county records, each owner holding it briefly before relinquishing it to the next generation. No sale records, no renovation permits, no sign that anyone had tried, in recent decades, to make it livable. She called her mother the next day. Her mother sighed before she even finished the first sentence. Yes, she knew the place. Yes, it had belonged to Aunt Eleanor, though no one had called her that in years. No, she had never been there herself. People didn't go back. That was all she could really say. It was old, strange, inconvenient, too far from anything. The family had always treated it like a responsibility passed along until someone finally let it go. Why anyone had kept it at all was a mystery, but no one wanted to be the one who officially severed the line. When she mentioned considering a visit, her mother's tone changed. "Why would you do that to yourself?" she asked. "You have enough to worry about. Take the sensible route. Decline it. Let the county deal with it. It's not worth anything." After the call ended, she sat on the couch and stared at the wall long after the room had gone dark. Not worth anything. The phrase echoed in her head, attaching itself to thoughts she'd tried not to name. She thought about the apartment lease that would expire in 6 months, the rent increase already hinted at. She thought about the job that paid just enough to keep her afloat as long as nothing went wrong. She thought about her son, how small he had looked standing in the schoolyard that morning, swallowed by noise and movement. She did not imagine the house as a solution. She did not imagine a fresh start or a dramatic escape. She imagined it as a question she could not ignore. If she declined it, that would be final. Another door closed without ever knowing what was behind it. If she accepted it, even temporarily, she would at least be choosing something, instead of being carried forward by habit and fear. 2 weeks later, she packed the car. They brought only what they could fit without effort. Clothes, food for a few days, blankets, tools she already owned. She told herself it was just a visit, an inspection, a way to gather information before making a decision. She told her son it was an adventure, a short trip to see a place that had belonged to family. He nodded, accepting this without enthusiasm or protest, his eyes following the movement of her hands as she loaded the trunk. The drive took them through increasingly narrow roads, then onto gravel, then onto something that barely qualified as a road at all. The trees grew denser, the sky narrower. Cell service disappeared without ceremony. She felt the familiar tightening in her chest that came whenever she lost contact with the world she understood. But she kept driving, following printed directions because there was no longer any other option. The house did not announce itself. There was no clearing, no open yard. It revealed itself slowly, a shape that seemed to emerge from the slope rather than sit upon it. From a distance, it looked like a series of uneven levels cut into the hillside, each one receding slightly from the one below. Wood darkened by age framed the front faces, but the sides and back appeared to vanish into earth and stone. Moss crept along the edges. Small windows reflected the dull afternoon light without giving anything away. She stopped the car and turned off the engine. The silence pressed in immediately, thick and unfamiliar. Her son leaned forward, peering through the windshield. "Is that it?" he asked. She nodded, though she was not entirely sure. Up close, the structure felt less like a house and more like a part of the land that had been shaped, reluctantly, into something human. The front door was heavy, the wood scarred, but intact. When she pushed it open, the hinges protested softly, then gave way. Inside, the air was cool but not cold, not the sharp chill she expected, but something steadier, neutral. The smell was of earth and old wood, not rot. Light filtered in through small openings, revealing a space that was rough but not collapsed. The floor was stone. The walls were a mix of timber and packed clay, smooth in places where hands had shaped them long ago. Her son stepped inside first, his breath fogging slightly, then clearing. He took off his jacket without thinking. She noticed this before she noticed anything else. They explored slowly. The house revealed itself level by level, each connected by a narrow passage that slanted upward into the hillside. Some areas were cluttered with debris, others surprisingly clear. There were signs of habitation, old and layered. Marks on walls, shelves carved into stone, a table so worn it felt more like a suggestion than a piece of furniture. That night, they slept on the lowest level, wrapped in blankets, the sound of wind moving through the trees above them. She lay awake for a long time, listening for creaks, for signs that the hill might shift and bury them where they lay. But nothing happened. The temperature remained steady. The cold stayed outside. In the morning, frost covered the ground beyond the door. Inside, her breath did not show. She stood in the doorway, watching her son eat a simple breakfast, and felt something unfamiliar settle into her chest. Not hope, not relief. Something quieter. The sense that the place was not pushing them away. She knew then that they would not leave immediately. The house had asked its question, and she had begun, however reluctantly, to listen. The decision to enroll her son in the local school came less from confidence than from a quiet understanding that postponement would turn into retreat. The house had accepted them in its own mute and impenetrable way, but life could not consist only of walls that held warmth and rooms carved into earth. A child needed more than shelter. He needed days that repeated themselves with some kind of structure, voices other than his mother's, a future that did not narrow into isolation. She found the school listed on a faded county website that looked as if it had not been updated in years. One building, serving several age groups, limited staff. A bus route that wound through forest roads and collected children from distances that would have seemed unreasonable anywhere else. The nearest alternative was nearly an hour away. This one was 20 minutes, if the road was clear. The first morning they drove there together, the road dropped sharply from the hillside before leveling out and threading its way through trees that seemed older than any boundary lines drawn on maps. Frost lingered in the shadows even after the sun had risen. Her son sat quietly in the passenger seat, backpack on his knees, watching the forest slide past. He did not complain. That worried her more than if he had. The school appeared suddenly, much like the house had. A low building set back from the road, painted a color that had once been white. A few cars were parked out front. A yellow bus idled nearby, its engine humming steadily. Children stood in small clusters, some loud, some withdrawn, most dressed in layers that suggested long winters and parents accustomed to preparation. Inside, the administration was simple and direct. Paperwork was filled out by hand. Questions were practical rather than intrusive. "Where do you live? How old is he? Does he have any allergies?" When she gave the address, the woman behind the desk raised her eyebrows slightly but said nothing. That small reaction lodged itself in her mind. Her son stood close to her while they spoke, his hand gripping her coat sleeve. When it was time for her to leave, he hesitated. She knelt in front of him, adjusted his jacket, told him she would be there when school ended. He nodded, not trusting his voice. She waited in the car until the bell rang and the doors closed. Only then did she drive away. For the next few days, she followed the same routine. Drive down in the morning, wait longer than necessary in the parking lot. Return to the house, clean, sort, repair what she could. Prepare simple meals. Pick him up in the afternoon, and listen carefully for signs of distress he did not always articulate. The school did not overwhelm him, but it did not welcome him either. He was an outsider, quiet among children who had grown up together, who shared references and histories he did not yet understand. On the fourth morning, while she waited by the fence as children gathered, she noticed the man standing a short distance away. He wore a heavy jacket the color of wet bark, practical boots, and a cap pulled low against the cold. He was not watching the children so much as the road, his posture alert without being tense. A patch on his sleeve marked him as a forest ranger, though the insignia was faded from use. They exchanged a brief nod, the unspoken acknowledgement of two adults occupying the same small territory. When the bus arrived, he stepped aside to let children pass, his attention shifting momentarily to each one, as if counting them without meaning to. After the bus pulled away, he approached her. "You're new here," he said. Not as a question. She agreed, bracing herself for whatever followed. People in isolated places often asked questions that bordered on interrogation, driven less by curiosity than by the need to understand disruptions to familiar patterns. He gestured back toward the road. "That house on the south-facing slope. The terraced one. You're staying there." She felt a brief tightening in her chest. "Yes," she said. "It belonged to my family." He studied her for a moment, not unkindly, but with the careful attention of someone trained to assess terrain and risk. "That place hasn't been occupied in a long time," he said. "Winters can be rough." "So I've heard." There was a pause. He did not press further. Instead, he introduced himself, gave his name and role in a matter-of-fact way. He explained that his patrols covered much of the surrounding forest, including the land near her house. If she needed anything related to access, roads, or safety, she could contact the ranger station, though he admitted the response might not be immediate in winter. It was a practical exchange, stripped of warmth or suspicion. When he left, she realized she had been holding her breath. As the days passed, the rhythm of school began to shape their lives. Her son came home with small observations rather than stories. Names of classmates, the layout of the building, the fact that the teacher kept a plant by the window that no one was allowed to touch. He did not complain about being cold. He did not ask to leave. That alone felt like progress. At the house, she continued to explore. She cleared debris from one of the upper levels, discovering how the temperature changed subtly as she moved upward. She noticed that the highest spaces, though more enclosed, felt warmer, especially toward evening. She could not yet explain it, but she felt it with her body. The house did not behave like any structure she had lived in before. It seemed to respond to time rather than weather. Food was a constant calculation. What they had brought would not last long. The nearest store was far enough away to require planning. She learned to stretch meals, to cook in ways she had never needed to before. Soups that simmered for hours. Bread made from basic ingredients. Meals that filled more through warmth than abundance. One afternoon, as she struggled to free a door that had swollen with age, she heard a vehicle outside. She stepped out to find the ranger's truck parked near the lower entrance. He stood by the door, holding a small box. "I was in the area," he said, as if that explained everything. "Thought I'd check in." He handed her the box. Inside were potatoes, onions, a few cans of preserved meat, and a bag of apples. She stared at them, unsure how to respond. "Roads get worse as winter settles in," he added. "Easier to bring things now than later." She thanked him, embarrassed by the sudden swell of gratitude she could not fully contain. He waved it off, already turning back toward his truck. That evening, she cooked a proper meal for the first time since arriving. The smell filled the lower level, rising slowly upward. Her son ate with more enthusiasm than she had seen in weeks. When she asked how school had been, he shrugged, then said one of the boys had shown him where they kept extra pencils. It was a small thing, but she held on to it. Over the next weeks, the ranger returned occasionally, sometimes with supplies, sometimes just to ask how things were going. He never stayed long at first. He never asked questions that felt invasive. Gradually, his presence became part of their routine, as predictable and unremarkable as the school bus or the changing light in the house. She did not think of him as help, not yet. He was simply someone who existed in the same landscape, who understood the roads and the seasons and the particular challenges of living where they did. That was enough. By the time the first heavy snow fell, her son no longer asked when they would go back. He spoke instead of the hill behind the school, of the way the forest looked when the ground was white, of how warm the house felt at night. She listened, knowing that without realizing it, they had crossed a line they could not easily uncross. The road that led back to their old life still existed. She could imagine it clearly. But each morning, as she drove toward the school and watched her son walk through its doors, that road felt farther away, less urgent, less real. Winter did not arrive all at once. It gathered itself slowly in the forest, testing the land with colder nights and mornings that refused to thaw. Frost lingered longer each day, and the road that connected the Hillside house to the school became narrower, edged by ice that glittered deceptively in the low light. She learned to drive it cautiously, memorizing every bend, every place where meltwater pooled and refroze before dawn. Inside the house, the change was subtle but unmistakable. The air grew denser, the silence deeper. Snow muffled the outside world until even the wind sounded distant, as if it belonged to another place entirely. Yet the interior remained steady, not warm in a way that suggested comfort, but calm, resistant to extremes. She found herself touching the walls more often, pressing her palm against the packed earth and timber, as if trying to understand what she felt through skin rather than thought. Food became the axis around which their days turned. What had once been casual now required attention. She counted jars, weighed portions, planned meals not by desire, but by endurance. Breakfast was oatmeal or bread, warmed on the old stove. Lunch was whatever her son took to school, wrapped carefully, and meant to last until afternoon. Dinner was the most important meal, not because it was elaborate, but because it gathered them together when the light failed early and the cold pressed hardest against the doors. She learned how long soup could simmer without wasting fuel, how to thicken it with potatoes until it felt substantial. She baked bread in small loaves, using a recipe so simple it bordered on primitive. Flour, water, salt, yeast, patience. The smell of it filled the lower level and drifted upward, lingering in the narrow passages between rooms. Her son began to associate that smell with evening, with safety, with the promise that the day was ending as it should. The ranger came more often once the snow began to stay. Sometimes he arrived in the afternoon, sometimes just before dusk, his truck crunching to a stop below the house. He never announced himself. He would knock once, firmly, then wait. His visits were never framed as assistance, but the pattern was impossible to ignore. A sack of rice, a bundle of firewood already split, a wrapped package of smoked meat from a legal cull, accompanied by a brief explanation delivered as if it were a formality rather than a justification. She protested at first, awkwardly, conscious of pride she could not fully account for. He dismissed it with a shrug, reminding her that access would only get worse, that people looked out for one another in places like this. There was no condescension in his voice, no implication that she was failing. He spoke as someone describing the weather, stating facts rather than offering charity. Eventually, she stopped arguing and focused instead on using what he brought well. The food stretched their supplies in ways she had not anticipated. The variety mattered as much as the quantity. Her son ate better, more willingly, his appetite returning with the cold. He spoke more at the table now, recounting small details from school, observations that would have seemed insignificant anywhere else, but felt precious in the narrowness of their world. One evening, the ranger stayed longer than usual. Snow had begun to fall heavily, the road already fading beneath it. He accepted her invitation to sit, shedding his jacket and placing it carefully near the door. She served stew, thick and simple, with bread still warm from the stove. They ate in silence at first, the sound of spoons against bowls echoing faintly in the low-ceilinged room. Her son watched him with open curiosity, less guarded than she was. He asked about the forest, about animals they never saw near the house, about what happened to the land when no one was watching. The ranger answered patiently, explaining things without simplifying them beyond recognition. He spoke of migration, of winter behaviors, of how the forest slowed itself down to survive. After dinner, he lingered, warming his hands around a mug of tea. He glanced upward once, then again, as if orienting himself. "It's warmer up there," he said finally, not as a question. She nodded. "I think so. I'm not sure why." He did not press. Instead, he rose and followed her as she showed him the narrow passage leading to the next level. As they climbed, the temperature shifted perceptibly. By the time they reached the upper space, he removed his hat, his breath no longer visible. "That's unusual," he said quietly. She felt a flicker of something like validation, though she had not yet named the thing being validated. She had noticed the warmth, but she had not trusted it. Hearing it acknowledged by someone else made it real, in a way her own observations had not. From then on, the house began to reveal itself more clearly, not through sudden discoveries, but through accumulation. Patterns emerged. The upper levels retained heat longer. The lower spaces stayed cool, but never cold. Even when the fire burned low overnight, the temperature did not drop the way she expected. She found herself sleeping more deeply, waking less often to the sound of wind or the imagined creak of shifting earth. Her son noticed it too. He started doing his homework on one of the higher levels, dragging his books up there without explanation. When she asked him why, he shrugged and said it felt better there. Warmer. Quieter. School settled into routine. He no longer hesitated at the door. He had found a place for himself, modest, but real. A friend, or at least a companion, someone who walked part of the way home with him before branching off toward another distant house. She watched this from the car one afternoon and felt a loosening in her chest she had not known was possible. Outside, winter deepened. Snow piled against the front of the house, forcing her to clear paths daily. The ranger showed her how to do it efficiently, where to throw the snow so it would not drift back, how to read the wind. He spoke less now, comfortable in shared tasks that did not require explanation. Meals became a ritual rather than a necessity. Even when he did not visit, the memory of those evenings lingered. When he did, they ate together without ceremony. Sometimes they talked, sometimes they did not. The silence was not heavy. It was companionable, shaped by the shared understanding that not everything needed to be filled. One night after he left, she walked through the house alone, candle in hand. She moved slowly, deliberately, feeling the differences between spaces, the warmth near the ceiling, the cool steadiness near the floor, the way the walls seemed to hold the day and release it gradually into the night. She thought of the generations that had passed the house along without settling into it, without listening to what it offered. She did not yet know what the house was, not fully, but she knew it was more than shelter. It was doing something intentional. And for the first time since arriving, she allowed herself to wonder whether this place had been waiting, not for anyone in particular, but for someone willing to stay long enough to notice. Winter pressed in harder, sealing them into their routines. The road became unreliable. The outside world shrank. Inside, warmth gathered, meals continued, and help arrived in the form of presence rather than rescue. She did not think of herself as being saved. She thought instead of being supported by something older and quieter than any plan she might have made. The house, the school, the shared table. These were no longer temporary measures. They were the shape her life had taken, almost without her consent. And as the snow fell thicker around them, she understood that leaving would no longer be simple, even if she wanted to. The winter settled into its deepest register, with a quiet authority that did not announce itself. Days shortened until light felt like a brief courtesy rather than a given, and the forest took on a stillness that was neither peaceful nor threatening, but complete, as if the land had turned inward to conserve itself. Inside the house, life continued along the narrow paths they had established. School mornings, careful drives, meals prepared with the same patient attention she had learned to give everything else. The house answered the cold by remaining what it had been since they arrived. Steady, resistant, quietly alive. She began spending more time on the upper levels out of necessity rather than curiosity. The lower rooms had served their purpose well, but the higher spaces called to her with their calm warmth, especially in the afternoons when the sun slid low and the temperature difference between inside and out sharpened. She carried up boxes of belongings she had left untouched since the move, sorting them slowly, discarding what no longer felt necessary. The act of clearing was methodical, almost meditative. She worked with gloves on, careful of loose stone and brittle wood, mindful of her son's presence whenever he followed her up the narrow passages to watch or help. One afternoon, while clearing a section of wall that had been partially obscured by debris, she noticed a line that did not belong. It was subtle, easy to miss, a seam where packed earth met something harder beneath. She brushed at it with her glove, then with her bare hand, feeling the difference in texture. The wall here was smoother, deliberately shaped, unlike the rougher surfaces around it. Her son crouched beside her, watching. "What's that?" he asked. She did not answer immediately. She fetched a small tool and worked carefully, removing layers of dirt that had been packed into place long before either of them existed. As she cleared the space, the outline of a square opening emerged, its edges reinforced with old wood darkened by age. It was sealed, but not randomly. This had been done on purpose. The realization made her pause. The house had been revealing itself slowly, but this felt different. This was not a feature meant to be seen or used casually. This was something hidden. She waited until evening to continue. When the ranger arrived, as he often did on days when the road was still passable, she showed him what she had found. He studied the opening in silence, his expression intent. He ran his hand along the edge, testing its solidity. "This isn't structural damage," he said finally. "This was built this way." Together, they worked to open it, removing the old seal without forcing it. Behind it was a narrow vertical channel, extending upward, beyond what their candlelight could immediately illuminate. It was not a chimney. There was no soot, no trace of smoke. The walls were lined, carefully finished, the space just wide enough for air to move freely. "It runs up," he said, craning his neck, and down. The discovery shifted something fundamental in her understanding of the house. This was not a series of rooms carved into a hill by chance or necessity. This was a system. Whatever its purpose, it had been designed, considered, executed with intention. They explored further over the next days, tracing the channel through the levels. It connected spaces in a way that defied ordinary logic, creating a vertical spine through the house. Near one of the upper sections, concealed behind another carefully sealed panel, they found a small cavity. Inside it rested a metal box, its surface dull with age but intact. Opening it felt like crossing a threshold she could not step back from. Inside were papers, bundled and wrapped against moisture. A notebook bound in leather, its pages filled with tight, precise handwriting. Diagrams drawn with care, showing cross-sections of the house, measurements, notes in the margins. There were legal documents as well, deeds and registrations that predated modern classifications, written in language that spoke of ownership in terms of stewardship rather than possession. She read slowly, her understanding growing with each page. The house had been built not as a shelter of convenience, but as an answer to a problem. The notes described principles she recognized intuitively from living there. The way heat rose and was guided. The way earth held temperature, absorbing and releasing it over time. The way minimizing exposure changed everything. This was not improvisation. This was applied knowledge, tested and refined. The ranger took the documents seriously, his professional distance momentarily set aside. He photographed pages, noted dates, names. He recognized the significance before she did, understanding how rare it was to find something like this intact. "This wasn't just an old house," he said. "This is an early engineered structure. Someone thought their way through winter here." The implications unfolded gradually. If the documents were authentic, and everything suggested they were, the house could not be dismissed as a derelict structure. It had historical value, engineering significance. The land records complicated things further. The property had been misclassified over time, its status eroded by neglect rather than law. Correcting that would not be simple. As if summoned by the act of discovery itself, pressure arrived soon after. A notice appeared, delivered with official language that carried the weight of authority. An inspection was scheduled. Concerns were raised about safety, habitability, zoning. The phrases were familiar, bureaucratic shields used to clear obstacles rather than address realities. She felt the old fear return, sharp and immediate. The house that had sheltered them now felt vulnerable. The stability she had begun to trust showed cracks, not in its walls, but in the systems that governed it from a distance. She imagined being told to leave, to uproot her son again, to explain why the place that had finally felt right was being taken from them. The ranger did not minimize the situation. He explained what inspections meant, how decisions were made. He also explained the power of documentation, of evidence presented clearly and correctly. He offered to help, not as a favor, but as part of his responsibility to the land and its history. They spent evenings poring over the notebook, deciphering old terminology, matching diagrams to physical spaces. Her son listened from the edge of the room, absorbing more than she realized. He began pointing out connections himself, tracing paths with his finger, asking questions that forced them to articulate what they were only beginning to understand. The house, she realized, was no longer just a place they lived. It was a testament, a record of thought preserved in earth and timber. Someone had built it with the future in mind, even if they could not have known who would inherit it. As snow continued to fall and the outside world narrowed further, the stakes grew clearer. This discovery could secure their place here, or it could draw attention that would destroy it. She stood one evening on the upper level. The warmth gathered around her, and felt the weight of the choice forming ahead. Whatever happened next, she would not walk away without trying to protect what had been entrusted to her, intentionally or not. The house had revealed its secret. Now it demanded something in return. The notice arrived on a morning that looked deceptively gentle. Snow lay undisturbed on the slope, the forest hushed beneath a pale sky that promised nothing more dramatic than cold. She found the envelope wedged into the doorframe, its edges already damp from melting frost. The paper was thick, official, its weight out of proportion to the few sentences it contained. She stood there, reading it twice, then a third time, the words rearranging themselves each time into something more threatening than the last. An inspection, a preliminary determination, concerns regarding structural safety and residential suitability, temporary occupancy under review. The language was careful, distant, as if the people who wrote it had never stood inside the house, never felt the difference between the air near the floor and the warmth that gathered overhead, never heard the quiet patience of walls that had held winter at bay for longer than memory could account for. The letter concluded with a date and a list of requirements: documentation, access, compliance. She closed the door and leaned her back against it, the cold seeping through the wood into her shoulders. Her son was still asleep upstairs. For a moment, she considered not waking him, letting him stay in that untroubled place where the house was simply home, and winter was just a season that required thicker socks. But the sound of the kettle on the stove pulled her back into motion, and with it, the understanding that nothing could be postponed anymore. They spoke about it that evening after dinner, the three of them seated at the table in the lower level. The ranger had arrived earlier than usual, sensing something in her voice when she called. She laid the letter between them like a physical object that needed to be navigated around. He read it carefully, his expression tightening in places she could not immediately read. "This doesn't mean eviction yet," he said finally. "It means they're looking for a reason. Sometimes they already have one in mind." Her son watched them closely, picking at his food. "Are we leaving?" he asked, his voice steady but thin. She reached across the table and took his hand before answering. "No," she said. "Not unless they make us. And we're not there." The ranger nodded. "The documentation you found matters," he said. "A lot. But it has to be presented correctly. If they frame this as a safety issue, they'll move fast. If it becomes a historical and engineering question, things slow down. Slower means room to argue." The days that followed were filled with a new kind of labor, not the physical work of clearing debris or hauling supplies, but the careful assembly of proof. They spread the documents across the table, comparing dates, tracing ownership, identifying references that could be corroborated by archives. The ranger contacted colleagues, not all of whom were pleased to be involved. Some cautioned him to stay within his role. Others quietly offered advice, names, pathways through bureaucracy that might otherwise remain closed. She felt the pressure most acutely in small moments. Driving her son to school, wondering if it would be the last week he walked through those doors. Watching him do his homework in the upper level. The warmth settling around him like an unspoken promise. The idea of breaking that rhythm filled her with a grief that felt anticipatory, as if she were already mourning something not yet lost. The inspection date loomed. Snow continued to fall, complicating access, but not enough to cancel. She cleaned obsessively, as if order might influence judgment. She worried about the uneven floors, the narrow passages, the unconventional layout that would invite skepticism. She rehearsed explanations in her head, tried to translate lived experience into terms that could survive scrutiny. On the morning of the inspection, 2 vehicles arrived. A county official she had spoken to briefly on the phone, and another man she did not recognize, carrying a clipboard and wearing an expression of practiced detachment. They shook hands perfunctorily, their attention already scanning the structure as if looking for confirmation of pre-existing conclusions. She led them through the house, answering questions as they came. Yes, she lived there full-time. Yes, her child did as well. Yes, she understood the concerns. No, she did not believe the house posed an imminent danger. She spoke calmly, keeping her voice level even when the words felt inadequate. They noted the absence of conventional heating. They commented on the earth-integrated walls. They measured ceiling heights and scribbled notes she could not read. One of them frowned openly at the vertical channel, calling it unconventional, possibly unsafe. "This is an airflow system," she said, surprising herself with the steadiness of her explanation. "It's part of the original design. It distributes heat vertically." The men exchanged a glance that suggested skepticism rather than curiosity. The ranger intervened then, stepping into the conversation with a confidence that shifted the dynamic. He spoke not as a neighbor or a friend, but as a professional, framing the structure in terms they could not dismiss outright. He referenced early engineering principles, historical precedents, documented evidence. He produced copies of the diagrams, the notebook, the land records, laying them out with deliberate care. The atmosphere changed, not dramatically, but perceptibly. The inspectors slowed down. They asked different questions. They took photographs with more attention. The house, which had seemed like an inconvenience to be resolved, became something that required thought. Still, nothing was decided that day. They left with assurances that findings would be reviewed, determinations made. She watched their vehicles disappear down the road, feeling as if the ground beneath her had shifted, not physically, but in the fragile sense of balance she had come to rely on. The waiting that followed was worse than the inspection itself. Days stretched without news. She continued their routines with exaggerated care, aware that normalcy was both comfort and illusion. Her son sensed the tension despite her efforts. One evening, as they prepared for bed, he asked if the house could be taken away. "I don't know," she said honestly, "but we're doing everything we can." "I like it here," he said. "I don't want to go back." She held him longer than usual that night, listening to his breathing until it slowed. Afterward, she climbed to the upper level and stood alone. The warmth gathered near the ceiling, wrapping around her like a living thing. She pressed her hand against the wall and felt the stored heat radiate back, steady and patient. The house had survived neglect, misclassification, indifference. It had endured because it was built with understanding rather than assumption. That thought steadied her. The call came a week later. Preliminary findings acknowledged the structure's uniqueness. Concerns remained, but the documentation warranted further review. No immediate action would be taken. Additional assessments would be scheduled. Time, at least for now, had been granted. She sat at the table with the phone in her hand, long after the call ended, the ranger watching her from across the room. When she finally looked up, her eyes were wet, but clear. "We're still here," she said. He nodded. "For now, and sometimes, that's enough." That night, they ate together without speaking much, the simple act of sharing food taking on new weight. Outside, the snow fell steadily, indifferent to paperwork and authority. Inside, the house held its warmth, as it always had, waiting to see whether the people within it would be allowed to do the same. Spring announced itself reluctantly, as if uncertain it was welcome after the winter it had followed. The snow did not vanish so much as withdraw, thinning day by day, retreating into the shaded places between trees and along the northern edges of the slope. Meltwater traced new paths down the hillside, testing the ground, carrying away what had not been anchored deeply enough. The forest stirred, not suddenly, but with the cautious patience of something that had learned to survive by waiting. Inside the house, the transition was almost imperceptible. The steady warmth that had carried them through the worst of winter softened rather than disappeared, becoming gentler, less insistent. The air felt lighter. Doors that had resisted in the cold moved more easily. Light lingered longer in the upper levels, filtering through the small windows and settling into the rooms as if it belonged there. The final decision arrived without ceremony. Another letter, thinner than the first, its tone markedly different. The structure was to be recognized as historically significant, its engineering features noted as rare examples of early applied environmental design. Residential use would be permitted under specific conditions. Ongoing preservation requirements would apply, but no order to vacate would be issued. She read the letter at the same table where she had once spread documents in desperation, her hand resting unconsciously on the wood. This time, there was no surge of triumph, no urge to celebrate. What she felt instead was a deep, settling relief, the kind that reached past emotion and into the body itself. The ground beneath her life, so long unstable, had finally stopped shifting. Her son understood before she explained. He saw it in her posture, in the way she exhaled, and did not immediately brace herself again. When she told him they were staying, really staying, he nodded once, seriously, as if confirming something he had already accepted. That night, he fell asleep without asking questions, his trust no longer provisional. Life adjusted itself accordingly. The school year continued without interruption, the daily drive becoming less fraught as the road dried and widened. Her son walked more confidently now, his place among the other children no longer tentative. He brought home stories that stretched beyond observation into belonging, complaints about homework, opinions about teachers, plans that assumed continuity. The ranger's role shifted without ever being formally acknowledged. He did not arrive with supplies anymore, not because they were no longer welcome, but because they were no longer necessary. Instead, he stayed. Sometimes for dinner, sometimes to help mend a wall where winter had tested it, sometimes simply to sit and drink tea in the fading light, his presence unremarkable in the way that signaled permanence. They cooked together now, without assigning importance to it. Meals remained simple, but they were no longer acts of endurance. They were expressions of rhythm. Soup simmered while conversations drifted. Bread rose and baked. The table bore the marks of regular use rather than urgency. Her son set it without being asked, moving through the house with the ease of someone who knew its moods. The house itself seemed to respond to the season, not dramatically, but with a subtle recalibration. The earth that had held heat so faithfully in winter now moderated the warming days, keeping the interior cool when the sun grew strong. She noticed how the same principles that had protected them from cold now shielded them from excess warmth. The system did not favor extremes. It favored balance. One afternoon, while cleaning the upper level, she found herself standing still, struck by how ordinary the moment felt. The fear that had once framed every decision was gone. In its place was something quieter, more durable. She understood then that the house had not saved them in any dramatic sense. It had simply provided the conditions in which saving themselves became possible. The ranger spoke of changes ahead, of paperwork he would need to complete, of adjustments to his own role, now that his involvement was officially documented. There were risks, he admitted, consequences he would accept without complaint. He did not present this as sacrifice. He spoke of it as alignment, as the natural outcome of choosing to stand where he already stood. They did not define their relationship. They did not need to. It unfolded through shared tasks, through evenings that ended without urgency, through mornings that assumed each other's presence. Her son accepted him without hesitation, not attaching labels, simply making space. The house settled into its new chapter as if it had been waiting for it. Repairs were made with care rather than haste. Adjustments honored the original design instead of overwriting it. The documents were stored safely, no longer hidden, but not displayed either. They were part of the structure's memory, not its decoration. On a late spring evening, they sat together on the upper level, the windows open to air that carried the scent of thawed earth and new growth. The forest sounded alive again, layered with movement and possibility. Dinner had been eaten, dishes cleared. Her son leaned back in his chair, content in the loose, unguarded way of someone who no longer needed to monitor his surroundings for danger. "This house is warm," he said, after a long pause. "Not just now. Always." She smiled, waiting. "It's not because it's old," he continued, searching for the words. "It's because someone thought about it, like they knew winter would come." She reached across the table and squeezed his hand, understanding more in that moment than she could articulate. The house was not warm because of its age. It was warm because it was built with attention, with respect for forces larger than any single season or owner. It endured because it worked with the world instead of against it. As the light faded, she felt no urge to mark the moment as an ending. There was nothing to conclude, no lesson to underline. The story did not resolve into triumph or closure. It simply continued, grounded now in something that could carry weight. The house had stayed. And because of that, so had they. If this story mattered to you, subscribe to the channel. More stories like this are coming next. Watch other videos on the channel to continue the journey. And if you think this story should be seen by others, share it.